recording. Where were you born and when?
I was born in Sydney, Ohio in October 1955.
So you're a Libra?
Yes.
Uh-huh. And you've done work in Russia, the UK, Sweden, as well as all over the US. Do you find that there's differences in approaches if you're working in another country? I'm sure there is. If you're working in Russia, it's different.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially at the times that I was in these different places. So when I was at Harvard, they were still actually very psychoanalytic. That one of the discussions among the residents there was where to buy your psychoanalytic couch, which I thought was really funny, coming from Johns Hopkins, which was extremely biological in its orientation. And so I really got to experience both kinds of training, and I really think that the best approach is a combination of everything.
Because we are a combination. We're not just biological. We're environmental and spiritual, and yeah, we're not one or the other.
Right.
Do you know your Myers-Briggs or your Enneagram types?
Well, I don't really fit into any type very easily, but seriously, I really don't. But I think that if I were to look at the Enneagram, I mean, I definitely started out as a 1. I'm a recovering perfectionist. That's what I tell people. But I'm also an artist, and I'm also someone who's a peacemaker, and so I have these different hats that I wear.
Right, which makes life interesting. What kind of artist?
I've done a combination of things. I mean, when I was a teenager, I learned how to sew, and so I started doing designing my own clothes, and so I did sort of my own little fashion industry, and also interior design. And I can paint, and I can sculpt, and I was a member of the New England Quilters Guild, and I still do interior design. I've remodeled and restored 5 houses. And it's something that I've done professionally as well as a hobby. So and then I'm also a dancer.
I'm a dancer too. What kind of dancer are you?
Well, I started out as a child. My mother wanted me to be another Shirley Temple, and so she used to get my hair permed, and I started with tap dance when I was 4. And I come from a long line of musicians, and that related to several jazz musicians, so I do jazz improv. And then I've also trained in Middle Eastern dancing.
How wonderful. And you said you also come from a long line of scientists, like your father had 3 graduate degrees, and so you have both influences.
Yes, and my mother was a polyglot. She was fluent in multiple languages and wanted to be an interpreter for the United Nations. And her mother was fluent in 3 languages because she was born in Paris to an American professor of Greek and Latin who was doing his sabbatical at the Sorbonne. And she had a German nanny, so she grew up speaking many languages as well.
That's fabulous, really. And what about the Quaker influence? Was that kind of predominant in your spiritual upbringing when you were young?
No, it wasn't. I mean, it's kind of interesting. I come from a long line of Quakers. My ancestors left England in the early 1600s, so they joined the Quaker Church very, very early, and came to the U.S. I'm also a descendant of the Winthrop woman, who was the niece of the first governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, who ran off with a Quaker, and which didn't really go over well with the Puritans. And she had a Native American slave that she was kind of given by her uncle, and she didn't believe in slavery, and she returned this woman to her homeland. And she was granted what's now Greenwich, Connecticut. She was granted that land for having done that, but it was taken away from her for being a woman and for being somebody who was considered, she was just too independent. for those time periods. But she was actually accused of being a witch because she had worked with her father in his apothecary. He was the apothecary to Dr. Harvey, who discovered the circulation of the blood.
Oh, right.
And so she was working with him, and she knew a lot about herbal medicine. And this Native American slave knew a lot about Native American herbal medicine. And so they were combining the knowledge, and they were actually helping people. And that was really, that was enough to get you accused of being a witch back then.
Oh, yeah. So do you think there's some kind of ancestral memory, genetic imprint that impacts us?
I wonder about it. When I read the story of my 8th great grandmother, when I say 8th, that means 8 greats before grandmother, I really was, it gave me chills because I could really relate to her as a person. And so here she had worked with her father, who had done research with Dr. Harvey, and I, as a little girl, was at the knee of my father, who was a scientist and a mathematician, and he was a cardiovascular physiologist and the head of the artificial heart program at Battelle Memorial Institute, which is the reason why we were in Columbus, Ohio. So there's this similarity there. And then there's this, I also went through my own kind of little witch trial for being willing to stick my neck out and talk about controversial topics such as ESP. That's really something that didn't go over very well with the medical establishment, because it's something that they really consider to be impossible.
Mm. You know, there's an old saying about when there's a change, a scientific discovery, the first reaction is to ignore it, then it's ridicule, then it's acceptance, and it's, well, I thought of it. So it seems like we're in that ridicule first stage in terms of psi research and paranormal research and what the brain can do.
Well, I would say that we were in that stage for sure during most of my career. I mean, what's interesting to me is that it was much more acceptable. People that are 10 years older than me, they actually had courses in college on these phenomena. And so it was something that they really cracked down on and stopped funding at around the same time that I went to university. And I would say in the last couple of years, I have started to see it get accepted again as a possibility by more and more people in academia. More and more scientists are coming forward and saying that either that they've had some of these experiences themselves, or that they witnessed enough things that they really think that we need to start changing the paradigm. So I'm actually feeling it shifting right now, and that's very, very exciting to me to see this, because I speak at various conferences, and so I've seen them sort of evolve over the years.
It seems to me that maybe the meditation research, the Tibetan monks, meditation changes their brain at University of Wisconsin, the mindfulness meditation of John Kabat-Zinn, that seems that it was kind of an opener that in terms of mind-body acceptance, that there's some scientific basis for it. Do you think?
I think that that's part of it. But I think that in addition to that, there have been the authors who've been physicists who have really pointed out the parallels between the changes in physics that are really over 100 years old now.
Quantum physics.
So, it's quantum physics, correct. And so when we look at how we change how we think about things like the atom, that it's not a solid little ball, that it's actually predominantly space, and that you have these subatomic particles that can act either as a particle or as a wave, depending upon whether or not they are measured. That really puts consciousness in our interaction with the physical world right there in the forefront. And so because I was gifted at math and science, and people assumed I was going to become a physicist, and I have a brother who is a physicist. I've studied a lot of physics, and for me, it just made sense from that standpoint that these things were certainly allowable in the physical realm, and they've been reported throughout history across all cultures. And so then I was wondering, well, what is the hang-up? Why is it that these things are so difficult for people to accept?
And what do you think is the hang-up?
Well, I think that there's a variety of factors going into it. I mean, first of all, you have a lot of people who are vested in the status quo. They've made their career on the current paradigm, and they're not going to change their opinion on things. There's a saying that science advances one funeral at a time. And there's some truth to that when you're that sometimes you really need, the older generation that had a certain set of beliefs. They need to no longer be the ones that are the dominant people driving things. So that's part of it. There's also fear for a lot of people when they hear about things like telepathy or precognition. It really is scary to them because they then have to look at life in a different way. Telepathy, for example, if that's real and people can access your thoughts, then you better make sure that not just your underwear is clean. And I think a lot of people are afraid of someone being able to really know what they really are thinking.
Or my experience, a lot of people who've had precognition insights, it was about something negative. Someone was going to die, and so they want to turn it off.
That's the other piece, is that there's this spook factor, and people don't really have the discernment as to know whether or not something is a precognitive dream or just a bad nightmare about your worst fear. And I have talked with people who've experienced both of those, and there really is a qualitative difference, but most people don't know that. And so the thought that if they have a bad nightmare, that means that's going to happen is really a scary thought. But I also think that our notion of time is another issue in terms of whether or not, if precognition exists, whether or not then we can really say there truly is free will, and how much free will is there. Because there's this concern that if you can predict the future, then and that's because the future already coexists, then it implies that we're just moving along towards an inevitable fate. And a lot of people, that's very disconcerting to them. People like to think that they have more control. Now, the reality is I think that's too simplistic of a way of thinking about precognition, because just because you can have precognitive experiences does not mean that everything is predetermined, not at all. But that requires really getting into the science more to understand that. So, but people, their knee-jerk reaction is to think that then you're implying that it's already just sort of set what's going to happen.
But it's only set because of what we've done. So it's cause and effect, which doesn't really undermine free will. It just means that there's consequences for what we do, and they bleed into the future. They impact the future because of cause and effect.
Right. I mean, some people would just say that it's basically karma. And some things, the karma of it can take more than one lifetime to play out, and other things can take decades. Some things, there's instant karma where you get to experience it right away.
Right. Oh, so what led you to med school rather than being a physicist or whatever?
Well, a lot of it had to do with the fact that I was doing my research as an undergraduate at a time when the Vietnam War had really gutted a lot of the financing for research. And so I was doing research in the laboratories with professors who were really pretty disillusioned about the funding of science. And they saw that as a scientist, I would really have a much better position of getting funded if I became a doctor. But also the other thing was that I didn't want to do research on animals, and I wanted to understand human consciousness as opposed to, what neuroscientists were doing, which to me was, not really, you would never be able to ask the kinds of questions I was the most interested in. And so I went on to medical school, not really realizing what I was getting myself in for.
What do you mean? What didn't you realize?
Well, I didn't, I had no idea that they would push you to the brink physically. I mean, I used to being challenged mentally. I mean, in terms of, I've always been able to take, really challenging courses, a lot of them, and do the academics with ease. But when starting the end of your second year of medical school, you start spending the night in the hospital, and you're up all night doing things like starting IVs on people and drawing blood and doing spinal taps. And where I trained at Johns Hopkins, they gave medical students the kind of responsibilities most people don't get until they're interns. So, I mean, I delivered many babies. But you're doing all of this on no sleep and still having to do studies and take tests and have everyone grading you, and so it's an incredibly challenging thing to go through. And as I said, it's not just the academics; it's the fact that you're doing things to people. You're working with people, and I'm somebody who's such an empath that for me, having to stick people with needles who don't have really healthy veins or whatever, it just wasn't my idea of a good time. Let me put it that way.
Yeah. No, it's torture. It's torture. What kind of approach did they emphasize when you were doing your work to be a psychoanalyst? What kind of approach?
Well, so So while I was studying the biopsychosocial aspects of humans in my psychiatry residency, we had a psychotherapy supervisor, and so I also had patients that I saw for outpatient psychotherapy. And when I was on faculty at Harvard, it was one of the perks of being on faculty there that you also would have a psychoanalyst as your psychotherapy supervisor. Mm-hmm. And I think that psychoanalysis is really it's almost becoming a forgotten art, and people are starting to now question whether or not psychotherapy should even be part of psychiatry training, and I think that's a huge mistake.
So it's just pharmaceuticals.
That's right. So what happened is that even the medical schools, their funding for scientific research got gutted by things like the military budget and things going towards other. Basically, everybody's competing for just a certain amount of money, and the pie gets divided up, and science tends to be what gets the short shrift. That in the arts, and so what happened is that the pharmaceutical companies just stepped in where where everybody else stepped out, and so it became increasingly pharmaceutical, and in the orientation, and that really is just about treating symptoms with a Band-Aid that oftentimes doesn't work, and it's not a permanent solution. And again, it creates lots of lots of times people have other symptoms, and so it to me is. It's just really it's a shame of what's happened within psychiatry. It's one of the reasons why I left academia, is that I really didn't like the direction that it was headed in.
Right. How did Harvard come to be interested in mind body? I think when you were there was interest in that field.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, Harvard was very psychoanalytic when I was there, and if you really go back to Freud. He one of the things that he talked, I don't agree with everything that Freud said. He was wrong about a number of things, but at the same time, he saw this connection between unconscious and unexpressed feelings and the body. And it used to be, if you go back to last century, there were a lot of what were called hysterics and people who had conversion disorders, people who would, rather than feel their anger towards their mother or their father or whatever, they would instead, they'd lose their voice, so they couldn't speak, or they'd lose their ability to move their arm. And I actually had seen some of these patients in my training in the emergency room, where they would undergo a neurological workup and they wouldn't find anything wrong with them. And then I'd sit down and talk with them and say, well, what was going on at the time you had this onset of paralysis? And then they would describe to me that they were in the middle of a fight with somebody or whatever, and helping them to link that with the onset of the symptoms oftentimes was enough to stop the symptoms. So I witnessed that. And so this knowledge that the mind, and the placebo effect is another great example of that, where you could give somebody a sugar pill and about 30% of people will get better just because you've given them something that is a symbol of something they believe will help them feel better, and then they do feel better.
What amazes me, even if people know it's placebo, if you give them a big red pill, it has more impact than a smaller white pill, even if they know it's placebo.
That's true, although it does differ from culture to culture, because there's some cultures in which they will view, for example, a white pill as they'll think that must not be very potent, and they prefer a black pill. And then there are other cultures in which they might view the black pill as evil, and the white pill as being, pure. And so it's so different colors have different meanings for us, and so it really is all about what it is for that particular individual.
Would you say that med school was the most challenging time of your life, or what have been your biggest challenges, and then how did you cope?
Well, I would say the first 2 years of medical school were actually a highlight of my life. I loved the first 2 years of medical school because that's when it was so much learning, and the professors that I was interacting with were just such amazing superstars. So I really learned from the top scientists there are. But I would say, yes, I'd say this, the second years of two years of medical school and then the 4 years after that of my training were really pretty brutal, because you basically have absolutely no life. You're not getting you're hardly ever getting any sleep, and and you've just got tremendous responsibility. And I have a personality, though, where I'll tough through something. It's just my personality. If I know there's an end in sight, I'll do it. And I'm able to roll up my sleeves and work hard and push through things. But I've had challenges throughout my life, starting at a very young age. So it's really hard to say. As a child, I was so different from other children that I was bullied, and we moved around so much that I was always the new kid in school. And I had had, by the time I was 12, I'd had several near death experiences, in the sense of times that I almost died. And so I've had a lot of things that I've had to deal with, and I think that's one of the things that made me a better therapist, was that I had to go through my own process of healing and becoming whole after having just my world shattered over and over again. And I think that my capacity to change my mind about how I see something is probably one of my biggest strengths, my ability to think out of the box and solve something that other people, they can get pretty fixed in their thinking about how to approach something, but I have an ability to really kind of come at it from a different angle.
Because you kind of had to.
Mm-hmm.
When you had the near-death experiences, did you have the, going through the tunnel, being of light, those kind of typical blissful experiences or not?
No, no. I almost drowned when I was about 12, and what I had then was I had a life review. So when I heard about a life review, where you have your whole life flash in front of you in really what can only be seconds, but time is compressed, just like in dreaming, such that you experience it as though it happened over a much shorter period of time. And it's resignation to, oh, well, I'm going to die, and I know my mother's going to get upset because she won't see me at dinner. I mean, so that was kind of an interesting experience. And then the next thing I remember was being on the shore, and somebody had come in and rescued me, who had been a lifeguard. He saw me go down in the river, went in after me. And then another time, it was one of those things where I was mountain climbing with my father, and I was only about 4.5 years old, and he didn't have any sense of protectiveness. He didn't hold my hand or have any rope or anything, attached to me. And so and back then they didn't have the guardrails like they do now, and then a lot of the parks and whatnot. And I just slipped right off the side of the cliff when the dirt underneath me started crumbling. And so I was hanging off the side after having fallen, I don't know, maybe 16, 20 feet. And so I knew that I could have died. I mean, that made a huge impact on me that I came that close to it. And so I've had these kinds of experiences where it's not nothing like the near-death experience that even Alexander had. But I had an experience when I was applying to medical school in which I was hit by someone when I was crossing the street, and it was a rainy day, and there was a row of parked cars, and I couldn't see them coming. They were on a bicycle. And the next thing I knew, I came to on a neurosurgery floor after having been unconscious for several hours. And when I came to, I just had this change in how I saw things that I couldn't articulate. It was impossible to put words to it. But I had this sense that there was more order in the world than I had thought before, even as a mathematician and scientist. And I had had an argument or discussion the night before with this woman who was a math major, and she had asked me what graduate school in math I was applying to. And I said, I'm not going to graduate school in math, I'm applying to medical school. And she said, well, how can you give away the gift that God gave you? And I said, how did you get this far in math and believe in God? And she said, because I didn't know that you could, my father was an atheist, and everybody that I'd ever met who was a scientist and a mathematician didn't believe in God. And so I said that to her, and she said to me, well, how did you get this far in math and not believe in God? And so we had this interesting discussion, and I explained to her, I said, it's not that I'm opposed to the idea, it's just impossible. If you're not brought up with that, I mean, I hadn't even heard the name Moses until I was around 11 years old. I mean, I really was not exposed to any religion at all, except for the fact that we still had to say, even though I was in public schools, we had to say the Lord's Prayer. And I didn't know what I was saying. I was just kind of trying to, as kids do, they try to fake the words. But so I really didn't know anything about religion. And so when I told her that I just thought it was impossible, I also then ended by saying something, well, I wish I believed in God, but it's impossible. And so then the next morning when I got hit, and then I came 2 hours later in the neurosurgery suite, I was like, I realized, oh my God, I said I wish I believed in God. And I said, is this what that is? Is that what's going on here? Do I now have this sort of belief? So what I didn't even know what that meant. I had no framework for that. So what I did was when I had time, I spent reading scriptures from various religions, trying to find something that made sense to me. And I first resonated with Buddhism because it talked about suffering and how life is suffering. And the way out of that suffering is for us to accept life more for what it is, instead of trying to turn it into something other than what it is. And that just made such perfect sense to me that that's where I began my journey, and then looking more and more into spirituality and looking for universals across different traditions, as opposed to looking at what is it that separates different religions from one another. I wanted to know what is it that everybody seems to agree on.
And what would you say that is? There's an afterlife, there's a creator, cause and effect.
I would say that one of the universals is that it keeps coming back to this sort of that there are certain principles by which we should be living, and so it's really more of as opposed to it being the cosmology, because there's differences in the cosmology across these different religions, but all of them really come back to that we should really try to embody that way of being that, whether you want to say it's Buddhahood or you want to say it's Christ-like, or whatever it is you want to call that way of being, that non-judgmental, loving way of being in the world is something that I think really we keep coming back to. It's really what I'm most interested in, is what it tells us as humans in terms of how we should be living our lives. And the consequences, whether or not you think that there's a heaven and hell, I personally think that we can't ever really know for sure until we're on the other side what that is. But I can tell you for sure that there is a heaven and hell while we're still alive, that people create their own heaven and their own hell by their belief systems and by their actions and what they do. And so I don't even need to think about whether there's an afterlife or not for me to discuss such matters.
There are people like Eben Alexander you mentioned, and Edgar Cayce and Robert Monroe, who have traveled to those other dimensions, which some people could call heaven or hell, but are just different vibrational levels, I guess. So some people have mapped it. What happens on the other side?
Oh, I think they're probably, given the fact that we live in a multidimensional universe, which is something that comes out of string theory, and I understood this concept of multi-dimensions ever since I was a little girl, and I read the book Flatland, which really had a big impact on me, and realizing
2 dimensions.
I'm sorry?
With Flatland, where they had just 2 dimensions.
Right, and then what would it look like if you had something that's 3-dimensional enter your 2-dimensional world? And you're going to experience it very differently than someone who lives in a 3-dimensional world. And so realizing that, it once again, it tells us what the ancients have told us, which is that what we perceive as reality is really an illusion. It's really a construct of our own mind. And so once you realize that it's as much a construct of our mind as dreaming is a construct of our mind, then you can start to play with it, and all sorts of things can happen.
Like what?
Things that people might call magic.
Like what has happened to you that's magical?
Oh my! Oh, I've had so many magical things happen. So many magical things where so you one of the questions that you asked was about synchronicities, and I can have periods of time in which the synchronicities are just so profoundly off the charts, like that just has me splitting at the seams, laughing at it, because it's just like, how could this be? How could this possibly be? One of my favorite synchronicities, I'll tell you briefly here, is that I've had a lot of synchronicities with ravens and wolves, which I thought was really interesting. I would sit in my office. I had an office on the 5th floor of a high-rise, and when I was working with a patient, and I would say something to them, which was something that was like a profound truth about them, I would get these chills, And so with the patient, they'd say, oh, my God, how did, that's so insightful, and how'd you know that, and blah, blah, blah. And at the same time that happened, a raven would fly by. And it happened enough, and it was so precise in the time, I just thought, well, that's really interesting. And then I had this friend who was doing work with a Native American medicine woman, and she said, well, there's something called animal medicine, and people have these different animals mean different things. You should look up what raven means. And so I looked up what raven meant, and I thought, some people say raven is it's a shapeshifter, and there's all these different beautiful stories about ravens, but ravens are one of the most intelligent species on the planet. I mean, they're remarkable on what they can do. And I had this, she said, well, go inwards, do a vision, it's safety. And I was never somebody who did that kind of thing. But I thought, okay, I'll try that. So I meditated, and I saw this image in my mind of a Native American. And then I went to the encyclopedia that somebody had given me a book about Native Americans that I hadn't looked at. And I went to see if there was anybody dressed like this Native American. And when I opened it up, what I found was there was this woman that was dressed just like that. And it said that when that this was a tribe in the Pacific Northwest, and that they had female shamans, and this was an image of a female shaman. And I thought, well, isn't that interesting? Because I had had a dream that I was initiated as a Native American shaman. So then I dove to my computer, and I punch in, that was when we had Encarta, one of those discs that you put in the computer, and I put it into the computer, and I type in the name of this tribe, and there's this little article there, and it says that when the shamans are initiated in this tribe, they're always accompanied by ravens and wolves. And at the very moment that I was reading that, I heard two ravens outside in my backyard cawing, and right between them was a wolf. And I'm just like, wow, that's incredible.
That is incredible.
And at the same time that was going on, I was doing research on my ancestry, and I discovered that the Quakers on my father's side, Fitz-Randolph, that the name Randolph means raven wolf. It's an old Viking name, and the Vikings worshipped Odin, who always went into battle with ravens and wolves. And so to find out that at the same time that I'm doing ancestral research, that my family name means raven wolf, and at the same time finding out that Native American shamans from this tribe in the Pacific Northwest get initiated by them. Then on top of that, while I'm on the phone, this is all within a short period of time, within a month or so, I'm on the phone with this woman who contacted me after I sent her a letter saying that I was doing genealogy research. This was back in the early 90s, so it was before we had all of the access that we have now. When I'm on the phone talking to her, and she's saying to me, you really need to talk with this woman named Laurel Gable, because she did extensive genealogy research on the family. When I'm talking to her about that, at the very moment that she says that to me, and this is when I'm living in San Diego, a lightning bolt, and that's rare for it to have lightning down there, lightning lights up the sky, and I see what my dog is barking at, and it's a raven on the other side of the glass. And at that very moment, because I looked at the clock, my other phone line had rung, and it was Laurel Gable calling me. That's just the beginning of the story.
Oh boy.
So I could go on and on, but it's one of those things where that's a snippet of a month of my life in which all of the synchronicities with ravens and wolves happened, and it's.
Do you think this is like a past life influence, or do you think it's like your higher guidance saying we want to send you in this direction of doing kind of modern day shamanic work, or you must have speculated about where all the unity of that message came from?
Well, I really, I didn't know exactly what to make of it at the time, and and this was, we're talking about over 20 years ago, and so I've had enough things happen since then that I have even more hypotheses about what could have been going on, because I mean, since then I've actually been made an honorary, member of a Native American tribe, and I'm being trained in Native American medicine, and it's something that just happens so organically. It's just remarkable. It wasn't something that I pursued. And similarly, I have a very different view of how sort of the other side works. I mean, I really think that we're oftentimes sent messengers, and the messengers can come in a variety of forms, but that we are sent messengers, and it's to me it's just a very profound, almost like a wink, saying to you, yeah, we're glad you're checking out the ancestors here, that there's really, the Native Americans believe that your ancestors are there with you, that when you go to ceremony, that your ancestors are there with you, and so it's important to know who your ancestors are, because they're always here behind you.
Yeah. So do you think this propelled you into doing shaman-like work, healing work?
I think that I wouldn't say that it propelled me in the sense that then I thought, oh, okay, I'm going to do this kind of work. It's more that I started to read more about shamanism and discovered that in many ways my path is really that of a shaman. I mean, the trials and tribulations that I've gone through, the kinds of experiences that I've had, the mystical experiences, that these are the kinds of things that happen to someone who's in the process of doing that. And I have worked with so many people and helped so many people. It wouldn't surprise me if there's more going on than just my working with them in a way that's just me being a good doctor.
Do you think that there are like these guides, like individuals who are helping you, or do you think there's just like these akashic records of universal information field that's feeding you, or do you have a sense of who's directing these messages to you from the other dimensions?
No, I mean, I don't. I think that what's interesting is I think that for whatever reason, I don't have. I'm very grounded, and I think that I have to be very grounded. And so, and for whatever reason, and it may be because I am so grounded, I don't have these kinds of. I don't ever see anything. And when I'm talking about an image, it's just like the same image if I were to say, think about what your mother looked like when you were a little girl. I mean, you'd be able to come up with an image in your mind. Although not everybody can do that, but it was more that kind of an image. And so I've never had anything that could really tell me, is it Akashic records, is it Ancestry? But there's no reason to say that it's either or. I mean, it could be all of the above. I mean, it really could be that all of the things that people have been telling us are true, because these ideas are found so commonly throughout the ages and across different cultures, and they don't die. And to me, if something is true, then it's harder to kill it. And there sure has been an attempt to squash our belief in these things.
How did you get started on the ESP research? What triggered that?
Well, when I was at Harvard, I was the person who would go to, as the attending physician. I worked with medical students and residents, and I was the senior clinician to go and see patients who were on the medical and surgical floors who were thought to have a psychiatric condition by the house staff. And so a typical reason to ask me to come would be something like a conversion disorder. If they had done a complete evaluation and they thought that the person didn't really have a physical basis behind their illness, then I'd get called in. But another reason why they bring me in would be is that somebody wanted to sign out of the hospital against medical advice because it's necessary for you to be deemed competent. And if you're insane, then you can't really make the decision properly. So they had a patient there who was claiming to see ghosts and claiming to be psychic and wanted to leave against medical advice. Then they asked me to come in. And when I went in to see her, she said that she was psychic and that she was seeing ghosts and that she wanted to leave because she knew the test would come back normal. And they were blood tests for a suspected heart attack. And back then it took at least a day and a half or so to get that blood back. No. So I told her that I was concerned about her leaving the hospital and that I wanted to just sit down and talk with her a little bit. And most psychiatrists would have just signed the paperwork saying, this woman, you're right, she's psychotic, and taken away her rights to leave. But instead I thought I'll just talk with her and see if I can reason with her. I'm pretty good at doing that. And what happened was in the middle of that, she started to say things like, you have this aura that looks a lot like Christ. And I'm like, oh yeah, really? Uh-huh. And then she said to me, and I'm getting a reading about you. I'm getting all this information about you. Do you mind if I share? And I said, sure, go ahead. And she said, you're married to a chemist, which was true. I was married to a fellow classmate of mine from medical school who did an MD and a PhD in biochemistry. And he was that very week, he was applying for a postdoctorate in biochemistry at Johns Hopkins and at UCSD. And the next thing she says to me is, and he's applying for a job in 2 different cities right now. And so
That's good.
And that she got my attention.
Oh,
I said,
yeah.
You know, I said, well, which cities? And she said, well, name some and I'll tell you. And she said, you're going to move to San Diego, but your husband's going to want to move to the other city, but in his heart of hearts, he wants to go to back to the other city, which I knew was true. He wanted to go back to Baltimore, and he was somebody 13th generation Baltimorean and born at Johns Hopkins, but had family there. But anyway, we ended up in San Diego. And she told me a lot about the things about myself that there was just no way she could have known, and made predictions about the future. And and she was right about her test coming back normal. And so I was just so impressed that she knew things that there was just no way she could have found out from anyone. That even the people that were on that unit, they didn't know these things about me. I mean, these weren't people that I worked with closely. I was in the psychiatry department, so I'm not somebody who's hanging out on the medical floors talking to nurses or people about my personal life. So they didn't know any of this stuff. And she worked in a whole different, facility. She didn't work in our hospital, the patient. So there's just, it raised all these questions in my mind. And I thought, well, if this stuff is real, if people really can tell you what the future is going to be, then we need to be able to account for that in our model for what we as human beings can do. And so I became interested in trying to understand, why is it that some people have these abilities and other people don't? What is different about the way that their brain is wired that makes it so that they can, and most of us, if we do have these experiences, they're nowhere near as profound as that kind of capacity.
And what did you find? Are there differences that you can measure in brains of people who are psychic?
Well, it really turned out to be, there were some things that were surprising in my findings, and then there were other things that went along with what people have been saying for a long time. So one of the things I did was I looked at, I basically worked with people from all ages, all backgrounds, all walks of life, all kinds of psychiatric. I've seen it all. And so I have a large repertoire of individuals to draw upon and think about, who is it that reports these experiences the most, and is there some kind of commonality? And so some of the people who report these experiences the most are women more than men.
Yeah.
For example, it's more common in young children, very young children, like 3 years old, 4 years old, than in people that are, say, middle-aged adults. And so, so why is that? Well, one of the things that we know about young children is that their frontal lobes are not as attached to the rest of their brain as they are in adults. I mean, basically, that's one of the reasons why they have difficulty with impulse control and why they're so in the moment. And they can't think about consequences. Those are all frontal lobe things. But they also don't have this belief in, well, that's impossible. It can't happen. And so the frontal lobes are what kind of talk us out of believing in certain things. And so people with ADD, attention deficit disorder, they also report more psychic abilities. And that's because their frontal lobes are not as fully engaged with the rest of the brain. What's different between men and women is also something that's been reported, is that women tend to have different lateralization of the brain. What I mean by that is how is language encoded in the brain? And women tend to have language encoded more in both the left and the right hemisphere, whereas men tend to be more left hemisphere oriented. And of course, I'm talking about your average right-handed person, because it changes if you're talking about somebody who's left-handed. And but in general, there's this association of the right hemisphere with being more intuitive, and the left hemisphere is being more analytical. And what we see is that in people who are highly emotional, because the right hemisphere is more involved with processing emotions, when people are highly emotional, they're more right hemisphere. An artist, that artistic temperament, that's more right hemisphere sort of dominant. So when you have this shift from a culture where we're predominantly left hemisphere oriented to a population where they're more right hemisphere dominated because of either an accident that's occurred to them, or they're growing up in a culture that's more right hemisphere oriented in terms of the kinds of pursuits they do. They have a language that's more pictorial rather than it being letters, for example. All of these things that emphasize the opposite kind of brainwave pattern that most of us experience when we're awake. That's where you find these increase in these sorts of experiences. And people who otherwise wouldn't consider themselves psychic can oftentimes have a precognitive dream, for example, or a telepathic dream where they're dreaming that something happened to someone they love who's on the other side of the world at the time that it happens. And so when we're dreaming, once again, the right hemisphere is more active than the left hemisphere, and the back of the brain is more active than the front of the brain. And so it's a reverse of what it's like when we're awake, and it's very much the opposite of what the brain activity is of an analytical scientist. So they're the least likely to experience these things, and they're the ones who say these things are impossible.
And you said that there was kind of a skepticism about your book, the ESP book. On what grounds did people dismiss your findings? Scientific establishment people.
Actually, the scientific establishment has not dismissed my findings. Where I ran into problems is where people just judge me literally book by a cover. They see the title ESP Enigma, and they see that I believe that a scientific case can be made for it, and then they just dismiss me by seeing the title and just saying that's impossible. So anybody who's taken the time to read my book, it pulls them along, and they go, well, you're right. That makes sense, because what I do is I explain things like chaos theory and quantum physics and resonance and how all of those are informing us about how interconnected things are. I mean, there's different ways in which we can look at that and then and apply it to then our experience, because how we experience the multidimensionality of the world it's going to be in our mind. It's not going to be that we experience it so much in the physical, and what we think of as the physical. And so you have, if you want to explore those questions, and if there really is, a multidimensional world that's interconnected, then it's just people are going to be telling you what's going on in their own lives and in their own psyche, and so to dismiss that because we don't have a way of ourselves being in that person's head, literally seeing for ourselves through their eyes, hearing with their ears, is, to me, it's tremendous hubris and fallacy to do that.
It seems to me that the way we explain clairvoyance and telepathy on all those phenomena is just simply accessing the quantum information field, because we know that the quantum field is informational, and some people learn how to, or for some reason are propelled to access it. Does that make sense to you?
Well, it makes sense to me, but I think that what happens is that a lot of people, they get lost in the jargon. They hear the words quantum informational field, and they don't even know what that means. So it makes sense to me. But what I've been trying to do is to put things into a language that people can understand, that are scientists, because they have a real. A lot of them cringe when they hear their words that have a very precise meaning for them in their field being applied to something else, and then they just totally will shut you out just for that reason.
Right.
But I really have actually had, when I have a chance to actually talk with people or they read my book, I've had good success in getting people to understand what I'm saying and to agree with me and to actually convert over.
Entanglement and quantum non-locality, it shows to me that there's a scientific evidence of the connection between closely related particles, even, or waves, that they influence each other. If one changes, like these entangled particles, one changes far away, the other changes in response. That's, to me, clear evidence of this information field.
Yeah. Well, it's there's a lot of different ways to think about non-locality, and you even have physicists disagreeing about some of these things, because people are still trying to come up with a cosmology that makes sense. And I think that the non-locality can be explained by the multi-dimensions, because if you have say 11 dimensions, which is just that's one number in one person's string theory. If you have 11 dimensions, then just because we see the two particles separate from one another in three-dimensional space that we see, they could still be connected in the other 8 dimensions.
That makes sense.
And so to me, it's an artifact of our really not understanding multidimensionality.
So string theory has been proven mathematically, but not experientially, right?
It'd be hard to prove experientially, but yes, but mathematics, proving something mathematically is something that to me, who first cut my teeth as a mathematician, and who knows that is really kind of the final arbiter when it comes to science. I mean, if you can find that if you can find a formula, that's what really changed our idea about the atom. I mean, it was the mathematics. It was that's what changed quantum mechanics for us. It was the mathematics. It was seeing this formula that described what our observations were. And so mathematics is extremely important. It's just that most people are math phobic, and really they just kind of glaze over when it comes to math. But I am in my current, I know we're going to run out of time here soon, but in my current work, I mean, one of the things I'm doing is I'm working with a physicist because I really want mathematics to be applied to my theory, because it'll be stronger if there can be a mathematic expression of some of the observations.
So your theory of how people communicate telepathically, is that
well, actually, so we haven't gotten into what I've done is I've and I can talk for days.
I have plenty of time, so don't stop for me.
But I what I've been interested in is taking this whole model of why some people have more of an ability to tap into the Akashic record. What's different about them versus other people, for example? What was different about someone like Edgar Cayce, or what's different about someone like Kim Peek, who was the person that Rain Man was modeled after? Why did he have such an incredible memory when his brain was really disconnected because he had hydrocephalus? And so it really goes against, a lot of these cases of hydrocephalus really go against the neuron hypothesis about the brain, and thinking that memory is really just all about synaptic connections. Because how could somebody have such incredible memory when they have such a disconnected brain? It doesn't make sense to me that that's where it's at. And so what I'm coming up with is a whole different way of thinking about how the brain is kind of how the brain interacts with our consciousness field. I really think that we're asking the questions the wrong way. I think that rather than the brain being what generates consciousness, I think consciousness generates the brain. And that if we can look at the brain in a totally different way, looking at it more like it's the remote control that our consciousness field is able to activate, if you can follow me. So if you think of the brain as being something that is merely like our remote control, and it's got different buttons on it, that if you push this button, you'll get this app or this program. You push that button, and you'll get this. You push that button, you can speed up time. You push that button, you can slow down time. So looking at the brain more in that way as like a device that our consciousness field can use, and modeling that based on more components of the brain than just the neurons. There's all these other aspects to the brain. So looking at it with wholly fresh eyes and with that idea, that's what I'm talking about. And having a mathematician look at the different components of the brain with me and see if the math works out, because I have an idea about what's going on. That really is the it's too late in the hour for me to get into now, but what I've been interested in is the fact that people emit light, we emit photons, we have photoreceptors inside the brain, and we have photoreceptors in our skin as well, and we have receptors for magnetic fields in our eyes, and so we have all of these different receptors that aren't even part of the discussion about how consciousness works. But to me, if you're thinking about us as having consciousness that has light as one of its major components, then and seeing that the brain could have these little switches that could be turned on by light, and looking at it that way, it changes the way you see the brain entirely.
In my excuse me, in my clairvoyant training, they really emphasize the pineal gland, which is connected with light. That when you were doing clairvoyant work, the pineal gland was being activated. So I wonder if that fits in.
Yeah, that fits in with my theory, absolutely, because the pineal gland is actually a modified third eye. I mean, it originates evolutionarily as an eye.
Wow.
If you look at, there are lizards that still have an eye that's at the top of their head. And then what happened is that as we evolved and we started adding the limbic system, and then we added the cortex, and we added all this brain tissue, that the pineal went in deeper. Okay, so but it's a modified eye, and so yes, it's very much a part of my theory, is looking at the pineal in a very different way. So it's very exciting.
It is. And then, but where does the math come in terms of frequencies or vibrations, or how does math apply?
How does math apply?
Yeah, to their theory. I mean, how is it useful?
Well, what it is it has to do with looking at these structures that are in the brain that are receptors for light and for electromagnetic frequency, and really seeing whether or not they are within the range of in the same range, and so that they would be able to be interacting with the light. So I'm trying to understand the readout mechanism. If you kind of think of the brain as being like a player piano. And remember, have you had the scroll of the music? And you think of our consciousness field as being like the scroll. And when it comes through, it plays the keys of the piano, and you hear the music. And so I have this idea that there are these receptors that could be playing a role in reading the consciousness field. And that consciousness field is in the shape of a torus, which is something that's been reported by a lot of people. Mm-hmm. And so it's a matter of looking at just the engineering of it and the math of it in that sense. I'm not talking about mathematics in the same way as the Schrödinger equation, which changed how we viewed the atom, but I'm talking about mathematics in the sense of if I were an engineer and I had a device and I wanted to know, is this a device that really could perform this function, then you have to run it through various mathematical sort of formulas to see if it makes sense.
Got it. Can you make time for a few more questions?
Yeah, just a few more.
Okay. You mentioned that you're an empath, and but you stay grounded. How do you do that so that you don't get swamped by the issues of the people that you're working with?
Well, because I'm an artist, I surround myself with beauty, and so I love nature. So. And I live in beautiful Oregon, where I'm surrounded by nature. So I think that the being involved in the arts, being involved in nature, and also seeing that I actually help people and get them well. So when I'm with one person who's really just at rock bottom, I can call upon in my mind all of these other people that I've seen who are at rock bottom, who I was able to help, and I know that that they're really doing well now, and so that makes a huge difference. If I wasn't effective at what I did, I couldn't continue to do it.
Right, it'd be depressing. Then I wanted to ask you, the world situation looks so grim, and it looks like it's getting worse rather than better with all the autocrats that are being elected, the most recent one in Brazil. So do you have hope? Do you think that an Aquarius Aquarian age is dawning, or where are you in terms of our future?
I actually do have more hope for our future than I think most people do right now. And one of the reasons for that is that I don't believe everything that I hear in the media. I think that the media purposely uses fear to divide us and to manipulate us. And the reality is that when I meet with people, I find that a lot of the things that are put out there on the media as things being really dire, it's not really as bad as that.
Climate change, growing inequality, millions of people hungry.
Well, this is what I'm saying, is that these things have been going on for a long time, and what I'm seeing is more and more. So if you actually meet with people who are in the trenches, okay, that what's happening is that they've been working towards solutions for these things, and they're starting to mobilize and not look to the government or not look to private industry to provide us with what we need. There's more of a movement of people realizing that we don't need what they have to offer. We can actually. It's us keep going to them, just like with the scientists who keep going to mainstream academic science and saying, listen to me, I've got this theory, I've got this different thing, and ESP is real. They're not, if I'm just waiting for their approval, for them to agree with it, then that's not going to bring about change. So what's happened instead is that there's a new science academy in which there's 350 scientists, all of whom signed this manifesto for a post-materialist science, which from all around the world, 350 scientists signed this document saying that we believe that there's enough evidence to say the materialism is dead, and we're not going to ask for your permission anymore. We're going to found our own science academy. We're going to have our own research funding. We're going to have our own educational program, et cetera, et cetera. And so that kind of thing, to me, is reason for hope, where you have people who just say, I'm not going to, I'll still work with the system, but I'm not going to look to them to open up the doors to make it happen. So more of these grassroots movements, where you have people saying, yeah, I'm fed up with whatever it is. You're fed up with the homeless situation. You're fed up with how mentally ill people are treated in this country. You're fed up with how the elderly are treated. You're fed up with whatever it is. Campaign, finance, whatever it is that you're not happy about. People are mobilizing and starting to form their own programming, their own way of dealing with these things, rather than waiting. You have people who, even though, it hasn't been that successful thus far, the SpaceX program and whatnot, you have people in the private sector saying, I'm going to create the spaceships. And so, not that I'm saying that spaceships are what we need, but what I'm saying is that that's just one example of where you have people in the private sector and in the community grassroots saying, I want to do something about this, and I'm not going to wait for the government to do it. So I think that, if you look at how things are, there are a lot of people who are suffering right now, but I also see a lot of people who are upset about that and who are mobilizing, and they're not waiting for a system to come and step in and do it, because they've just seen how the system doesn't do it.
Right.
The system just... Everybody just gets so polarized, and everything has become so profit oriented. And so having people who just step out of that and just say, okay, we're going to do it a different way. So you have increasing number of doctors that are leaving the medical system per se and creating practices in which they just say, pay me a retainer every month, and I'll answer the phone when you need me and take care of you. Instead of it being pay the insurance company, and then if you're lucky, one of us will get, you'll get reimbursed or I'll get paid. And after going through all these middlemen, that bogs down the system, and it takes longer for people to do with just a simple interaction between the doctor and a patient. I mean, you spend in a medical care system, you spend 5 minutes with the patient, 10 minutes with the chart.
Yeah.
And that's just not sustainable. It's not healthy. It's not good. Nobody likes it. So what I see is there's now this pushback. But so I see it as so it's kind of like if I see the pendulums, it's gone. Things have gotten so far out of whack that it's starting to swing back. But I'm not denying that things are out of whack still. But if I thought we were still going like this, then that's when I'd say, yeah, we're still in trouble. But I see that there's been enough. There's more people aware. I've been aware that there have been issues and that the system is broken in just about every single system that you can think of in this country. And I've known about that my whole career. And but more people are now waking up to that. They're realizing that we don't have as good of a system as we should, given how much money we throw into it.
Right. What's the name of the new group of scientists?
It's the Academy for the Advancement of Post-Materialist Science.
And you're part of it, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Last question. Who else should be in the book? Who's a visionary scientist?
Well, I don't know who all you've approached already. I mean,
can send you a list.
I'm sorry?
I'll send you a list, but who comes to mind?
Well, I'm sure you have Dean Radin in there.
Yeah.
And another person is Stephen Schwartz. I really respect his work a lot.
He's in L.A., right?
Stephen Schwartz? No, he lives in Washington State.
Oh, okay.
Another person, I don't know if he has time to interview you, but the physicist I'm working with is Daniel Sheehan, and he's got an interpretation of quantum mechanics that makes precognition not just possible, but probable. Then you have Julie Mossbridge, who's also at IONS, along with Dean Radin. She's doing research on precognition. The physicists, are easier to find, like Menes Kakafos, how do you pronounce that? Kakafos, I think it is. But anyway, if you go to I would recommend that you go to the Academy for the Advancement of Post-Materialist Sciences, if you look in there, you'll see all of these names of people. Larry Dossey, Charlie Tart, but people who, like Charlie Tart, who've been a parapsychologist their whole career, it's not quite the same narrative as someone like me who was totally immersed in the material model and then stepped out of it. But still, he's a visionary scientist. He's wonderful. So
great. Thank you. As soon as this is finished, let me turn this off.